Hello my friends! In this video we are going to paint this floral composition, and in particular I want to give you a few tips on how to lead the eyes of the observer. In particular, from the upper part of this page, concentrate the eyes to the center part of this composition, going down to the bottom of the page. So, are you ready to paint with me? My name is Luisa and this is the Lulu Blue Studio. Let's paint together. We start painting this cascade of flowers using a filbert brush. And I'm mixing a very light color value of pink, a sort of mixture of Quinacridone Magenta and yellow ochre. And I created the first flower not exactly in the center, but a little bit on the right side of the page. As I'm creating the first petals, I add a little bit of more Quinacridone Magenta into the center of a few petals, and I allow this more concentrated Quinacridone Magenta to blend through the wet on wet technique into the wet petals. To create these petals, I imagine the center to be in the area that at the moment I'm leaving empty, and I will add the center when the flower is going to be dry. The reason why I planned this tutorial is to show you a different way of laying your floral elements onto the page. What I'm trying to show you is that you can follow unconventional ways to think how to place your main florals onto the page. And in this whole floral composition, I'm going to show you how, for example, you can create this sort of cascade of flowers that is placed in the center right part of the page, with many flowers coming down the page in the right area. So you don't have always to think your floral composition and place your flowers in a S shape or Z shape. You can also think out of the box and create floral arrangements that are of this type. As I finished to create the first flower, I started to create the second one, and I've decided to use a bright color like transparent orange to create the first layer of the petals. I want the pink flower to be the hero flower of this whole composition. Therefore, these two orange flowers that I am creating at the moment are not going to be as detailed as the pink flower will be by the end. And therefore, for these flowers, I'm just highlighting with the first layer, with the very first light layer of pigment, the overall shape, and then with the second layer that I'm going to add with a round brush, I'm going to add a few more details. More details on the hero flowers and a little bit less details on these flowers where I don't want the eyes of the observer to be fixed on. I want the eye of the observer to look at this floral composition starting from the main pink flower, and for this reason I add more defining elements on this big pink flower. I add just a few white flowers that are going up to the upper left corner of this page because I want them to lead the eyes of the observer from that corner down to the bottom part of the page. I'm using a little bit of yellow ochre to define the center of these flowers, and since the pigment of the petals is still wet, this yellow ochre is blending very nicely in the center of the flowers. I add a little bit of brown to add more contrasting brush strokes, and then I take my flat brush to start to create a few green elements. I'm using a very light color value of green. It is mainly a mixture of Sap Green, and using mainly the side of this brush, I created these loose style leaves. I want the eyes of the observer to start looking at this page, at this floral composition from the upper left corner of this page and be dragged by this pink big flower in the center. And then I would like the eyes to follow these green elements down to the bottom of the page. Therefore, I'm going to take action and I'm going to create these green elements, following a little bit this shape and being careful to add different color values and different shapes for these leaves in order for the observer to look at this whole composition. I love using this cobalt green dark to add darker brush strokes into my greens. This is one of my favorite greens to use together with Sap Green. With this round brush, I mix a little bit of green and a little bit of yellow ochre, and I create this muted sort of green that I use with the very tip of this round brush to create just a few of the green elements within the flowers. I'm not adding a lot of pressure, I'm being very soft with my hand to create very fine brush strokes. And then I add a few yellow elements, sort of yellow filling flowers, with this round brush. This round brush is so soft and I'm holding my hand quite light in order to create this yellow element quite soft and not too big in size. I want them to be very loose and I want the eyes of the observer to notice them, but I don't want them to drag the whole attention in the whole composition. If you are interested in understanding how to paint loose style flowers and have one resource that collects all the supplies, techniques, and ways to paint loose style flowers, I've created an 18-page ebook that you can download by clicking on the link in the description below. You can also sign up to my newsletter and therefore get all of the news that are happening at the Lulu Blue Studio before anyone else. Back to our floral composition, in this moment I'm adding just a few green elements created with the tip of this round brush. These elements are not heavy elements of this floral composition, but just sort of filling green elements created with some fine lines and a few dots. As you can see, all of these elements up until now are created using very light color values of greens. And using still very light values of greens, I'm also adding a few leaves with this round brush. These leaves help me to create this cascade of flowers and to create these elements that drag the attention to the bottom part of the page. I'm adding a few brush strokes into the yellow filling flowers in the bottom part of the page, mixing a little bit of lemon yellow with a touch of transparent orange. And then I'm mixing a little bit of transparent orange with green to create a muted green that helps me to create additional leaves in the bottom part of the page. Using this same brush, I start to add layers on the main pink flower. The main pink flower is now completely dry. This is the reason why I started to add these layers now. To create layers, I'm using a mixture that is slightly more concentrated than the base of the flower. So I'm using a mixture mainly of Scarlet Red and Quinacridone Magenta. And I'm using mainly brush strokes with the belly of this brush to create this effect of shadows. I am placing these brush strokes where I imagine my petals to be formed. So I sort of try to highlight the shape of the petals. I'm adding a few brush strokes also on the orange flower, but I don't want to add too many brush strokes or too defined, because I want the hero flower to be the pink big flower that I have in the center of the page. So it is through this layering technique that you can decide and you can highlight which flowers you want to be the main protagonist of your flower composition, or where you want the eyes of the observer to be captured by. I highlight the center of the pink flower by adding a few dots, mainly in brown color and yellow color. I like to add brown and yellow brush strokes at the same moment because they can blend, because they are added while both are still wet. In the upper small flower that I've created, I decided instead to use a darker color, mainly a mixture of black with a little bit of yellow ochre, because this is a smaller flower and I'm not putting too much accent or too many layers on this flower. Therefore, having a darker center brings a little bit of connection between these flowers, the big one in the center and the small one in the upper part of the page. And then I keep adding more strokes and therefore more layers on the main pink flower. I'm using this round brush that holds a lot of water, and I am mainly using the belly when I want to create thicker brush strokes, and just the tip instead of the brush when I want to create thinner strokes. I take advantage of the wet on wet technique to add on these layers that are still wet some Scarlet Red that will blend. I do the same for the orange flower, and in this case I'm adding a few brush strokes of concentrated transparent orange and a little bit of yellow ochre, just to define better the shape of these petals. With this same brush, I start to build layers on the cascade of leaves in the lower part of the page. I'm using mainly some Cobalt Green Dark. This is the darkest green that I have, and I mix it with other greens, and I remember to change also the color values in order to create different effects. I'm creating a flower composition that is focused on the main pink flower in the center that has, let's say, a companion on the left side in the center with the orange flower. And the leaves are dragging the eyes of the observer down to the bottom part of the page, while the upper part of the page has some very light flowers and leaves that are not capturing too much the attention of the observer. So I was able to obtain this playing mainly with color values and remembering to add, for example, more layers in the areas and on the elements where I want the eyes of the observer to be more focused on. I felt the upper part was a little bit too light for my liking, so I just added at the end a few brush strokes in darker color. And we are reaching the end of this tutorial. I really hope you had fun, and if you like this sort of videos, please subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much. See you next time.